In the shadow of the Thames, where London's ancient stones have witnessed 1,000 years of triumph and terror, stands a fortress that has become synonymous with death itself. The Tower of London, with its imposing white walls and medieval battlements, appears deceptively peaceful to the millions of tourists who visit each year. But beneath its carefully manicured lawns and behind its historic facades lies a history so dark, so systematically brutal, that it challenges our understanding of human cruelty. For over 9 centuries, this fortress served as the final destination for those who dared to cross the crown. What began as a royal residence and defensive stronghold gradually transformed into Britain's most notorious execution site, where approximately 125 souls met their end on Tower Hill, with countless more perishing within the tower's walls themselves. These were not random acts of violence, but calculated displays of royal power, designed as much to terrorize the living as to punish the condemned. The executions that took place here were not merely about ending lives. They were elaborate theatrical productions, carefully orchestrated to send messages that would echo through the corridors of power and whisper through the streets of London. The Tower became a stage where the monarchy demonstrated the ultimate consequence of betrayal, rebellion, or simply falling from royal favor. Every beheading, every burning, every instance of being hanged, drawn, and quartered was a lesson written in blood for all to witness and remember. What makes the Tower's history particularly chilling is not just the number of executions, but the methodical precision with which they were carried out. This was not the crude violence of a battlefield, or the spontaneous brutality of a mob. Instead, it represented the cold calculation of state-sanctioned murder, where every detail from the choice of execution method to the final disposal of remains was carefully planned to maximize both physical suffering and psychological impact. The Tower's reputation as a place of horror was deliberately cultivated by successive monarchs who understood that fear could be their most powerful weapon. The very sight of the fortress on the horizon served as a constant reminder of what awaited those who challenged royal authority. Prisoners were often transported by barge along the Thames, passing through Traitor's Gate in full view of London's citizens, ensuring that their shame and impending doom became public spectacle before the actual execution even began. Within these walls, some of history's most influential figures spent their final days contemplating the gruesome fate that awaited them. Queens who had once commanded absolute power found themselves reduced to trembling prisoners practicing how to place their heads on the executioner's block. Religious reformers who had preached with passionate conviction were stretched on the rack until their joints separated, and their bodies could no longer support their weight. Children who should have been playing in palace gardens instead disappeared into the Tower's depths, their young lives snuffed out by uncles hungry for power. The Tower's executioners developed their craft with the same dedication that medieval artisans brought to their trades. They understood which methods would produce quick deaths and which would prolong suffering. They knew how to position a body for maximum efficiency and how to time each blow for greatest effect. Some, like the French swordsman brought specifically to execute Anne Boleyn, achieved legendary status for their skill with the blade. Others became notorious for their incompetence, turning what should have been swift deaths into prolonged agonies that horrified even the bloodthirsty crowds. But perhaps most disturbing of all was the Tower's systematic approach to torture, designed not as punishment, but as an intelligence-gathering tool. The rack, the scavenger's daughter, and the manacles were not instruments of execution but of interrogation, employed to extract confessions and the names of co-conspirators. Prisoners would be shown these devices before questioning began, with the mere sight often proving sufficient to loosen tongues. Those who maintained their silence faced hours or days of methodical torment, their bodies stretched and compressed until pain became their entire universe. The psychological horror of the tower extended far beyond the physical brutality of execution and torture. Prisoners were often held in solitary confinement for months or years, never knowing when their final summons might come. They lived with the constant sound of construction as scaffolds were erected and dismantled, with the echo of footsteps in corridors that might signal their death warrant being delivered. They watched from barred windows as other prisoners were led to their deaths, knowing that their turn would inevitably come. The tower's chambers witnessed scenes that would have been unthinkable in any civilized society. Queens who had once dined on gold plates were forced to practice placing their heads on executioners' blocks. Teenage girls, barely old enough to understand their alleged crimes, spent their final nights in prayer and preparation for deaths they could hardly comprehend. Distinguished lords and ladies who had lived lives of privilege found themselves sharing cells with common criminals, all equal in their shared fate. What emerges from the historical records is not just a catalogue of individual tragedies, but a systematic pattern of state-sponsored terror that spanned centuries. The tower served successive monarchs as both sword and shield, eliminating threats while simultaneously warning potential enemies of the consequences of opposition. Its very existence as an execution site became a cornerstone of royal power, a physical manifestation of the crown's ability to determine who lived and who died. The methods employed within these walls evolved over the centuries, but the underlying purpose remained constant. Whether victims faced the swift stroke of a sword, the prolonged agony of hanging, drawing, and quartering, or the excruciating compression of the scavenger's daughter, each death served to reinforce the absolute nature of royal authority. The tower became a place where the normal rules of human compassion were suspended in service of political necessity. As we prepare to examine the specific cases that have made the Tower of London synonymous with horror, it becomes clear that these were not isolated incidents of medieval brutality, but part of a carefully constructed system of control that persisted well into the modern era. The stories we are about to explore reveal not just individual tragedies, but a pattern of systematic cruelty that challenges our understanding of how civilized societies can descend into barbarity when power becomes absolute and opposition is treated as an existential threat. The horrors within the tower's walls began long before the condemned ever set foot on the scaffold. The journey to death started the moment prisoners passed through the infamous Traitor's Gate, a water entrance that had witnessed the arrival of some of history's most notable figures. This gate, with its iron portcullis and stone archway, became a threshold between the world of the living and the realm of the doomed. Prisoners transported by barge along the Thames would see the tower's walls rising before them like the gates of hell itself, knowing that few who entered would ever emerge alive. The selection of execution methods at the tower was never arbitrary. Each technique served a specific purpose in the crown's arsenal of terror. Beheading with a sword or axe was reserved for those of noble birth, a recognition of their status even in death. The French swordsman brought to execute Anne Boleyn represented the pinnacle of this craft, capable of severing a head with a single precise stroke. But when executioners lacked such skill, the results could be catastrophic. Historical accounts describe instances where multiple blows were required, turning what should have been swift deaths into prolonged butchery that horrified even hardened witnesses. For those deemed guilty of treason against the crown, a far more gruesome fate awaited. The punishment of being hanged, drawn, and quartered represented the ultimate expression of royal vengeance. Victims would first be dragged through London streets tied to a horse's tail, their bodies battered against cobblestones as crowds jeered and threw refuse. Upon reaching the execution site, they would be hanged until nearly unconscious, then cut down while still alive to witness their own disembowelment. The executioner would remove their intestines and burn them before the victim's eyes, ensuring they remained conscious for as long as possible. Only after this prolonged agony would death finally come, followed by the dismemberment of the corpse and the distribution of body parts throughout the kingdom as warnings to potential rebels. The psychological warfare employed within the tower's walls was as systematic as the physical brutality. Prisoners were often housed in chambers that had previously held other condemned individuals, surrounded by graffiti carved into stone walls by those who had already met their fate. These desperate messages, scratched into the stone with fingernails or makeshift tools, served as constant reminders of mortality. Some prisoners spent months or even years in these conditions, never knowing when their final summons might arrive. The uncertainty became its own form of torture, with guards sometimes arriving at cell doors only to deliver meals or remove waste, leaving prisoners to wonder if each footstep in the corridor might herald their death warrant. The tower's torture chambers represented a different category of horror altogether. These rooms, located in the lower levels of various towers, housed instruments specifically designed to extract information rather than to kill. The rack, known within the tower as the Duke of Exeter's daughter, could stretch a human body until joints separated and limbs dislocated. Victims would be strapped to the wooden frame and slowly pulled apart by windlass mechanisms operated by professional torturers. The process was gradual, allowing for periods of questioning between applications of pressure. Many prisoners provided the information their interrogators sought long before permanent damage occurred. But others maintained their silence even as their bodies were irreparably destroyed. The scavenger's daughter employed the opposite principle, compressing rather than stretching the human form. This device forced victims into an impossibly cramped position, with their heads pushed down toward their knees until their spines curved beyond natural limits. The pressure would build gradually, eventually causing ribs to crack and internal organs to compress until breathing became nearly impossible. Blood would flow from the mouth and nose as the body's systems began to fail. Like the rack, this instrument was designed to break the will rather than end life, though permanent damage was inevitable for those who endured prolonged sessions. The manacles presented perhaps the most deceptively simple form of torture. Prisoners would be suspended from their wrists, with their feet barely touching the ground or hanging completely free. What appeared to be a relatively mild restraint became excruciating as hours passed, and the victim's own body weight slowly dislocated their shoulders. The position made breathing difficult and caused circulation to fail in the hands and arms. Many prisoners subjected to the manacles suffered permanent nerve damage that left them unable to use their hands properly for the remainder of their lives. Within this atmosphere of systematic cruelty, certain cases stand out for their particular brutality or historical significance. The execution of Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, in 1541 exemplified how even members of the royal family were not immune to the Tower's horrors. At the age of 67, this elderly woman was dragged to the block after refusing to lay her head down willingly. The inexperienced executioner proceeded to hack at her neck and shoulders with multiple blows, creating a scene so gruesome that witnesses reported feeling physically ill. Her death took several minutes, during which she attempted to flee the scaffold while blood streamed from her wounds. The case of Margaret Pole also illustrated how political necessity could override any consideration of mercy or dignity. As the last member of the Plantagenet dynasty, she represented a potential threat to the Tudor line simply by existing. Her execution was not about justice for any specific crime, but about eliminating a bloodline that might one day challenge royal authority. This calculated elimination of potential rivals became a recurring theme throughout the Tower's history, with entire family lines extinguished to prevent future rebellions. Religious persecution added another dimension to the Tower's catalogue of horrors. During the reigns of Henry VIII and his daughter Mary, the fortress became a focal point for the violent religious upheavals that convulsed England. Protestant reformers under Catholic monarchs and Catholic loyalists under Protestant rulers found themselves facing identical fates within the same walls. The irony was not lost on contemporary observers that the same chambers which had held Catholic martyrs under Henry VIII later housed Protestant victims under Mary's reign, with both groups meeting equally brutal ends for their beliefs. The burning of heretics, while typically carried out at Smithfield rather than within the tower itself, was intimately connected to the fortress's operations. Prisoners would be tortured within the tower's walls until they confessed to heresy, or provided information about fellow believers, then transported to their fiery deaths at the stake. The journey from Tower to Smithfield became its own form of torment, with condemned individuals forced to travel through London's streets while crowds gathered to witness their shame. Some prisoners were so severely injured by torture that they had to be carried to their executions, unable to walk to their own deaths. The tower's role as a family destroyer reached its most horrific expression in cases involving children. The disappearance of the young princes Edward IV and Richard of Shrewsbury in 1483 created one of history's most enduring mysteries, but the implications were clear to contemporary observers. The idea that children could be murdered simply for their bloodline sent shockwaves through English society and established a precedent that would haunt the tower's reputation for centuries to come. Whether smothered in their beds or killed by other means, these young boys represented the ultimate victims of political ambition, their innocent lives sacrificed on the altar of royal succession. The systematic destruction of families within the tower's walls represented one of its most psychologically devastating aspects. Entire bloodlines would be brought to the fortress, with members forced to witness each other's torture and execution. The Boleyn family's destruction exemplifies this calculated cruelty. George Boleyn, Anne's brother, was executed just days before his sister, with Anne forced to hear the crowds cheering his death from her cell window. The sound of the executioner's axe falling on her brother's neck would have been audible across the tower grounds, a deliberate psychological torture designed to break her spirit before her own execution. The tower's record-keeping system reveals the bureaucratic efficiency with which mass murder was administered. Detailed ledgers documented not just the names and crimes of prisoners, but also the costs of their executions, the disposal of their belongings, and even the cleaning fees for blood-stained scaffolds. These documents, preserved in royal archives, demonstrate how the taking of human life had been reduced to administrative procedure. Each entry represents not just a death, but the systematic erasure of individual identity in service of state power. Women prisoners faced unique horrors within the tower's walls that reflected the particular vulnerabilities of their gender in medieval and Tudor society. Beyond the standard brutalities inflicted on all prisoners, women were subject to additional humiliations designed to break their spirit before breaking their bodies. Pregnant prisoners were kept alive only until they gave birth, after which both mother and child would face execution. The psychological torture of knowing that one's unborn child shared the same death sentence created a form of mental anguish that exceeded even physical torment. The case of Lady Jane Grey, the 9 Days Queen, illustrates how youth provided no protection from the tower's machinery of death. At merely 16 years old, this intelligent and devout young woman found herself caught in the political machinations of ambitious adults who used her claim to the throne for their own purposes. Her execution in 1554 was particularly brutal not because of the method employed, but because of her complete innocence of any real wrongdoing. Contemporary accounts describe her final days as those of a terrified child trying to comprehend why she must die for crimes she never intended to commit. The tower's influence extended far beyond its walls, through the practice of displaying body parts throughout London as warnings to potential rebels. Heads were regularly placed on spikes atop London Bridge, where they would remain for months or even years as they slowly decomposed in full view of the city's inhabitants. The psychological impact of these displays cannot be overstated. Citizens crossing the bridge would be forced to confront the rotting remains of those who had challenged royal authority, creating a constant atmosphere of fear that permeated daily life in the capital. The evolution of execution methods at the tower reflected changing political needs and technological capabilities. The introduction of gunpowder led to new forms of execution, including cases where prisoners were tied to cannons and literally blown apart. These spectacular deaths served dual purposes, eliminating enemies of the state while providing dramatic public entertainment that reinforced royal power. The crowds that gathered to witness these executions were not merely passive observers but active participants in a ritual of state-sanctioned violence that bound them to the existing political order. The tower's role as an intelligence-gathering center transformed many prisoners into unwilling informants long before their executions. The combination of torture, threats against family members, and promises of mercy that would never be honored created a network of coerced cooperation that extended throughout English society. Prisoners would provide names of associates, details of conversations, and information about planned rebellions, all in the desperate hope of avoiding or postponing their inevitable deaths. This intelligence apparatus allowed the Crown to identify and eliminate threats before they could fully develop. The religious dimensions of tower executions added layers of meaning that resonated throughout English society. Protestant reformers facing death under Catholic monarchs were seen as martyrs by their supporters, while Catholic priests executed under Protestant rulers became saints to their followers. These competing narratives of martyrdom and justice created deep societal divisions that persisted for generations. The tower became a focal point for these religious conflicts, with each execution serving to deepen rather than resolve the underlying tensions. The seasonal rhythms of execution at the tower followed patterns dictated by political necessity and practical considerations. Major executions were often timed to coincide with important dates in the royal calendar, maximizing their symbolic impact. The spring months saw increased activity as winter campaigns concluded and prisoners accumulated during the fighting season faced judgment. Summer executions drew larger crowds as better weather allowed more witnesses to gather and spread word of what they had seen. The economic aspects of tower executions reveal another dimension of their systematic nature. Professional executioners commanded high fees for their services, with skilled practitioners able to name their price for particularly important deaths. The cost of maintaining the execution apparatus, from scaffolds to torture devices, represented a significant investment in the machinery of state terror. Even the disposal of bodies became a commercial enterprise, with different methods employed based on the prisoner's social status and the Crown's desire to make examples of particular cases. The tower's medical facilities served the grim purpose of keeping prisoners alive long enough to face execution. Physicians were employed not to heal but to ensure that torture victims remained conscious during interrogation, and that condemned prisoners survived long enough to provide public spectacle. These medical practitioners operated under unique ethical constraints, using their knowledge of human anatomy not to preserve life but to prolong suffering in service of state interests. The psychological profiles of tower executioners reveal individuals who had to reconcile their professional duties with basic human empathy. Some developed reputations for efficiency and mercy, seeking to minimize suffering even while carrying out brutal sentences. Others became notorious for their cruelty, taking evident pleasure in their work and prolonging deaths for their own entertainment. The tower attracted both types, creating an environment where the boundaries between justice and sadism became increasingly blurred. The impact of tower executions on the broader English legal system cannot be understated. The fortress served as a testing ground for new methods of state violence that would later be employed throughout the kingdom. Techniques developed within its walls spread to other royal fortresses and eventually influenced execution practices across Europe. The tower's reputation for efficiency in eliminating enemies of the state made it a model for similar institutions in other monarchies. The documentation of Tower executions in contemporary chronicles provides insight into how these events were understood by those who witnessed them. Writers struggled to convey the horror of what they had seen while remaining within the bounds of acceptable political commentary. Their accounts, filtered through layers of censorship and self-preservation, nonetheless preserve glimpses of the human reality behind the official narratives of justice and royal prerogative. The Tower's transformation from royal residence to execution site reflects broader changes in English monarchy and society. What began as a symbol of royal power and luxury gradually became associated primarily with death and terror. This evolution mirrors the increasing centralization of state authority and the corresponding need for more effective methods of eliminating opposition. The fortress that had once hosted royal celebrations became a machine for producing royal security through systematic violence. The international reputation of the Tower of London as a place of horror extended far beyond England's borders. Foreign diplomats and visitors carried accounts of what they witnessed back to their home countries, spreading the Tower's reputation as a warning to those who might consider challenging English interests abroad. The fortress became a diplomatic weapon, its mere mention sufficient to convey threats without explicit declarations of war. The cultural legacy of Tower executions permeated English literature, folklore, and popular memory in ways that persist to this day. Ghost stories, ballads, and historical romances drew inspiration from the real horrors that had occurred within its walls, creating a mythology that both preserved and transformed the historical reality. These cultural artifacts ensured that the Tower's reputation would outlast the political circumstances that had created it. The Tower's most chilling executions often occurred not on the grand public stage of Tower Hill, but in the suffocating privacy of Tower Green, where only a select audience of officials and nobles bore witness to the final moments of those who had once held the highest positions in the realm. This enclosed courtyard, surrounded by medieval walls that trapped both sound and sight, became the setting for some of the most psychologically devastating deaths in English history. Anne Boleyn's execution on May 19, 1536, established the template for how queens would die within these walls. The French swordsman brought specifically for her execution represented Henry's final gesture of twisted mercy. His recognition that even in death, she deserved the swift stroke of an expert blade rather than the uncertain blows of an English axeman. Yet the preparations for her death revealed the calculated cruelty that defined the Tower's operations. She had requested the executioner's block be brought to her cell the night before, spending her final hours practicing the precise positioning that would ensure a clean death. Contemporary witnesses described how Anne's composure began to crack as the moment approached. She had maintained her dignity throughout weeks of imprisonment and trial, but the reality of imminent death finally overwhelmed her carefully constructed facade. Her ladies-in-waiting later reported that she spent the night alternating between prayer and rehearsal, kneeling repeatedly to perfect the angle that would present her slender neck most favorably to the blade. The morning of her execution brought an atmosphere of surreal formality to Tower Green. Officials arranged themselves in prescribed positions, while Anne emerged from the Queen's house wearing a gray damask gown and white ermine mantle, her dark hair tucked beneath a white coif that would soon be stained with her blood. The French executioner, whose name has been lost to history, waited beside a low scaffold that had been constructed overnight specifically for this purpose. Anne's final speech followed the traditional formula required of all condemned prisoners, acknowledging the justice of her sentence while subtly maintaining her innocence. But her words carried an undertone of bewilderment that witnesses found more disturbing than any protestation of guilt or innocence. She spoke of her surprise at finding herself in this position, as if she still could not quite comprehend how the woman who had once commanded Henry's absolute devotion now faced death by his order. The Tower of London stands today as both monument and warning, its ancient stones holding memories of systematic cruelty that shaped a nation through fear. From Anne Boleyn's practiced positioning on the executioner's block to the young princes who vanished into its depths, these walls witness the calculated transformation of human beings into instruments of political terror. The fortress that once housed royalty became a machine for their destruction, demonstrating how absolute power corrupts not just individuals but entire systems of justice. As visitors walk through its courtyards today, they tread on ground soaked with the blood of those who dared challenge the crown, their stories serving as eternal testimony to the dangers of unchecked authority and the fragility of human dignity when power recognizes no moral boundaries.